Our saint this week that we'll wander with is Saint Elizabeth of Hungary, who lived from 1207 to 1231, and her feast day is November 17th. Think about how much stuff you have. Think about the toys and games in your room and the clothes in your closet. Think about how many rooms are in your house and how many cars your family drives. Now think about what you want for Christmas or your birthday. How much stuff do you have? How much stuff do you want? Elizabeth of Hungary had nearly everything she could want. True, she lived almost 1,000 years ago, so she didn't have the televisions, computers, and CD players that are so important to us. But for someone living in the 13th century, Elizabeth had it all. Elizabeth was a princess, and at a very young age, she was promised in marriage to a prince of a neighboring country. That seems very odd to us, but among wealthy families of that time, most marriages were arranged by parents. When she was just 4 years old, Elizabeth's parents sent her to live with the family of her future husband. The castle was high on a rocky mountain, and from its towers, Elizabeth could look out over all the countryside and think about the future, when she herself would be queen of that land. That day came sooner than she expected. When Elizabeth was 9 years old, the prince she was promised to died, so she was promised again in marriage, this time to Ludwig, the second son. The next year, the king himself died, so Ludwig became the king. A few years later, when he was 21 and Elizabeth was 14, they were married. 14 seems awfully young to be married, but in those days, men and women started their lives as grown-ups much earlier than we do now. It was an exciting time for Elizabeth. Although she was still a girl in many ways, she was a queen, happily married to a man she loved and who loved her. When she had her children, 2 boys and a girl, Elizabeth's joy grew even more. So Elizabeth had everything, didn't she? She lived in wealth and splendor. She had servants, beautiful clothes, and banquets every night. Elizabeth could have just lived like that, rich and satisfied, for the rest of her life. She could have stayed busy in court discussing the gossip of the day and planning the decorations for parties. But Elizabeth couldn't do that. Even as a little girl, she'd known that the most important things were not wealth and a fancy palace. Elizabeth knew this because she had followed Jesus' teaching ever since she was a young girl. Elizabeth knew that while Jesus spoke about many things, he talked about the poor more than almost anything else. Elizabeth knew that Jesus told many stories about how the poor were to be treated. She remembered everything Jesus had said about living on just what we need and sharing the rest with those who have nothing. So as best she could, Queen Elizabeth tried to follow Jesus. Elizabeth tried, as often as she could, to dress humbly and simply. She refused to wear her crown when she went to Mass because there was only one ruler, and that was God. When Elizabeth had to host parties and banquets or preside with her husband at court, she wore her royal robes, but underneath them she always wore a rough skirt made of animal hair next to her skin. She wore this shirt to remind herself that although she was in a wealthy, powerful family, she was still a sinner just like everyone else. But that's not all. There was no way Elizabeth could just sit still and use her wealth for herself. It would not be right, especially when so many people in the countryside needed her. Why should she have all the extra wealth when people around her didn't even have enough to feed their children? So Elizabeth went to work. She gave money and food to the poor. But she didn't stop there. She didn't just give and then leave. Elizabeth stepped out of the castle high on the mountain and right into the lives of the people in need. She visited the sick and bound their wounds herself. Once she even carried a child with leprosy back to her own room in the castle. Her husband was upset at first, but when he looked at the child, he was sure that he saw Christ himself, and he understood what Elizabeth was doing. The sick of the kingdom started coming to the castle for help, but it was a hard journey up to the top of the mountain. Elizabeth didn't want the sick to suffer any more than they already had to, so she ordered that a hospital be built at the base of the mountain. Once it was built, Elizabeth went to the hospital every day to help. She had another hospital built too, as well as an orphanage. There wasn't any question that Elizabeth's heart was filled with the love of Jesus. Remember this too. Elizabeth may have been a queen, but during all of this time, she was still only a teenager. Elizabeth had children of her own, and many people in the royal family believed that helping the poor this way was not proper behavior for a queen. She had to be strong to defend her actions to her husband's family. It always takes strength to follow Jesus, and Elizabeth was a strong young woman. Her happy marriage came to a sad end when she was only 20. On his way to fight in a war, Ludwig fell ill with the plague and died far from home. Elizabeth was devastated. Her life got harder in other ways too. Once Ludwig died, she was forced to leave the castle and take her children elsewhere to live. None of that stopped Elizabeth from helping, though. She continued to work for the poor, and she built one more hospital. This hospital was for people with the most terrible diseases, such as leprosy and the plague. When she was only 24, Elizabeth of Hungary died. She was young, it's true, but she died close to Jesus with a peaceful, happy heart. She'd done more to help the poor in a few years than most people do in a lifetime. So think about Elizabeth of Hungary. She had everything. She lived in great comfort and luxury. She could have closed the door to the castle high on the mountain and spent her days just enjoying what she had. She could have spent her days looking at pretty pictures and listening to pretty music. But she didn't. She looked out the window and saw hungry people. She walked down the mountain and saw the sick and the dying. She heard orphans crying, and she looked into cold, barren huts to see who needed help. Elizabeth saw all of this and listened to Jesus. She opened her heart and spent her days and nights giving. It's what any of us would do if we could, isn't it? Saint Elizabeth of Hungary had great wealth and status, which she used to help others. Think of the gifts and opportunities you have. Do you use them for your own benefit or for the benefit of others?